The storm came fast. It raged through the Montana territory, tearing at the land like a beast hungry for destruction. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the chill of the mountains with it. The night was dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed everything whole, leaving only the sound of nature's fury. But in that dark, there was movement, swift and desperate. A lone rider, hunched low against the storm, pushed their horse harder, urging it forward through the pouring rain. Hea's heart raced faster than the hooves, pounding beneath her. Her baby rose, lay in her arms, barely breathing. The child had been burning with fever for days, and now, with no doctor in sight, she was certain the little girl wouldn't last much longer. Her mind screamed for help. But where could she turn? The nearest doctor was 2 days by horse, and she didn't have that much time. All she had left was faith and the hope that somewhere out here, someone would help her. When the barn came into view, she urged the exhausted horse toward it, praying the shelter would provide them a place to rest. The ranch house was dimly lit in the distance, a faint glow from an oil lamp visible through the window. A shadow moved inside, and then a tall figure stepped into the doorway. Hea's eyes locked onto the man, his silhouette cutting through the storm. Gideon Thorne, the rancher who lived here, had been a widower for 5 long years. His wife, Sarah, had died in childbirth, leaving him with nothing but the haunting memory of her smile and the empty space she had left behind. He'd known grief, and now he knew the weight of loneliness. His ranch, his life, everything had turned to dust in her absence. He took one look at Hea, then her child, and the urgency in her eyes told him everything. He didn't hesitate. "Get her inside," he commanded, his voice low and steady. Hea, trembling from exhaustion and fear, dismounted and stumbled toward the porch. As she handed him Rose, her words came out choked, desperate. "Please, save her. I have nothing else to give." Gideon didn't respond right away. He simply looked at the child, his gaze flickering with recognition. The symptoms were unmistakable: scarlet fever. His heart sank. He had lost Sarah to that same illness. The memories hit him like a wave crashing on the shore, and for a moment, he stood frozen in place, staring at the child in his arms. But then instinct kicked in. He hadn't forgotten how to care for a sick child, even if it had been years since he'd held one. He moved quickly, bringing Rose inside, setting her down by the fire. Hea followed, her hands shaking as she tried to catch her breath. Gideon wasted no time. He found a clean cloth and dipped it in cold water, applying it to Rose's fevered brow. He spoke quietly to Hea as he worked, his words a mix of instructions and reassurances. "We'll cool her down, get the fever under control. It's not too late." Hea stood by, her heart pounding, barely able to hold back tears. Her baby, her precious Rose, was slipping away, and yet this stranger was doing what he could to save her. She had no idea who he was or why he'd agreed to help, but she couldn't deny the deep sense of gratitude she felt. "I don't know what to do," Hea whispered, her voice raw. "I have nowhere to go, no family, no home." Gideon paused for a moment, looking up at her. His face, weathered by years of hard labor and heartache, softened. "Then stay," he said, his voice low but steady. "We'll fight this together. I don't have much, but you and Rose are welcome here. For tonight, at least." Hea's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and doubt crossing her face. Was he offering them shelter out of kindness? Or was there something more to it? "Stay," she repeated, her mind spinning with the possibility. But what choice did she have? She was alone, with no place else to turn. Gideon didn't wait for an answer. He turned back to the baby, continuing his work. The hours passed slowly as the storm raged on outside. But inside, there was a strange peace, a sense of hope that Hea hadn't known in a long time. As the fire crackled, she sat beside her child, watching Gideon work. He hummed a soft lullaby, a tune he hadn't sung in years. It wasn't for him, it was for Rose, for the hope that maybe, just maybe, she would survive this night. And as the storm howled outside, Hea allowed herself to believe it. That maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had thought. Maybe for once she could trust someone. Maybe for once she could hope. The night wore on, the fire burning low as Gideon and Hea kept watch over Rose. The baby's breathing grew more labored, each breath a struggle. Hea's heart squeezed with fear. Would her baby survive? Would she ever get to hold her again, free from fever and pain? But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, a soft sigh came from Rose. Then another. The fever hadn't broken yet, but for the first time that night, there was a flicker of something else, hope. And it was all because of the man who had taken them in, without question. Gideon glanced at her, his face unreadable. He hadn't promised her much, but he had promised this. They would fight. And that was all Hea needed to hear. The storm outside raged on, but for the first time that night, Hea felt something other than fear. She felt, perhaps, the first trace of peace in years. Rose's breathing becomes labored as the fever spikes. Will she survive the night? Dawn broke quietly over the ranch the next morning, the storm having subsided, leaving a fresh layer of snow on the ground. Inside the small, dimly lit room, Hea and Gideon sat by the fire, both exhausted. The baby's condition had not improved overnight. Her fever was still dangerously high, and she lay limp in Hea's arms. For the next 3 days, time blurred into a continuous cycle of worry, exhaustion, and tentative hope. Gideon worked tirelessly, keeping the fire stoked, boiling water for steam treatments, and preparing willow bark tea as an old remedy for fevers. Each hour, he checked Rose's pulse and temperature, all while quietly explaining the remedies his mother had taught him. Hea watched him closely, silently admiring his calmness under pressure. Though her heart ached as she could see the depth of his pain, he was reliving the loss of his own wife. As the fever raged on, Hea's mind kept circling back to the terrifying thought that she might lose her child, too. During one particularly quiet night, she noticed an old cradle, covered in dust, sitting in the corner of the room. It was a stark reminder of what Gideon had lost and what she feared to lose. In the stillness of that moment, as Rose lay motionless, Gideon began to hum a lullaby softly, the same one he used to sing to his wife and child. The melody filled the room, breaking the silence in a way that comforted them both, even though it was laced with grief. Then, just as the storm had passed, so did the emotional barrier between them. On the second day, in the midst of the tension, Hea shared her story with Gideon. How she had been widowed by a mining accident and how creditors had hounded her, threatening to take Rose away. As she spoke, she felt his sorrow merge with her own, creating an unspoken bond between them. By the 48th hour, Rose's condition reached a critical point. Her tiny chest no longer moved with regularity, and her skin grew colder. Gideon rushed to her side, his face taut with fear, and did what he had only heard about in stories. He began resuscitation, performing chest compressions and giving her breaths of life. His hands shook, his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to stop. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing, no movement, no sound, until finally a tiny gasp broke the silence. Rose's chest rose with air once again, fragile but alive. Hea collapsed in his arms, sobbing in relief, her breath catching in the wake of her overwhelming emotions. "You saved her," she whispered, clinging to him. Gideon shook his head, his voice steady. "We both did." That night, as the storm cleared, Hea and Gideon dared to believe they had passed the worst of it. But they knew the road ahead would not be easy. They had only just begun to fight for each other and for the future of the little girl who had brought them together. As the fever finally broke on the third day, Rose's skin returned to its natural warmth, and her eyes fluttered open. The storm outside had ended, but the questions remained. What would happen to them now? And could this fragile bond they'd forged between them survive the coming days? Hea began to pack her things, silently contemplating her next move, while Gideon stood watching, the uncertainty hanging between them. Would this be the beginning of something more, or would it be yet another chapter of loss? The answer, neither of them knew, but for the first time in years, both felt the stirrings of something they hadn't dared to hope for, a future. The morning after the fever had finally broken, Hea stood by the window, her fingers trembling as she packed the few belongings she had. The ranch house, once cold and silent, now felt alive with the memory of the last 3 days. She could hear the sounds of the fire crackling and the soft rustle of Gideon's movements in the next room. But as much as she wanted to stay, there was an undeniable fear gnawing at her. Where could she go now? With no family, no skills, and no future to look forward to, she felt like a stranger in this place, bound to leave once the storm cleared and roads became passable. As she folded the last of her things, Gideon appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft, and for a moment, Hea hesitated. She had considered it. After all, there was nothing here for her. But as she looked around at the life that had begun to take root in this house, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that leaving might not be the answer. She turned to face him, unsure of how to respond. Before she could say anything, Gideon's voice broke through the silence, firm but gentle. "What if you stayed?" he asked, his words lingering in the air between them. Hea blinked, surprised by the proposition. "Stayed?" she repeated, her mind racing. "What are you asking?" His eyes softened as he stepped closer, the weight of his own grief apparent in the quiet way he spoke. "I need help at the ranch. You need a place. You're welcome here, Hea, for as long as you want. Separate rooms, respectful." His words hung heavy in the room, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside had disappeared. Hea looked at him, her heart beating erratically as she processed what he was saying. Could she really stay here? The notion of a permanent home, of finding stability after so much loss, was tempting. But could she trust him? Was this really an offer to help her? Or was it something more? Gideon's eyes were filled with a quiet vulnerability, one that she had never expected to see in a man like him. "I haven't had a real meal in years," he admitted, looking away. "I haven't had a real life here either. It's just been me and the silence. I forgot what it sounds like, someone else in the house." Hea felt her heart soften at his confession, her own fears momentarily forgotten. But she still had her reservations. And what about propriety? People will talk. Gideon shook his head, a slight, wry smile crossing his lips. "I stopped caring what people said 5 years ago," he replied, his tone defiant. "We both lost too much. I'm offering you a chance to start over, Hea." The weight of his words settled in, and after a long pause, Hea finally nodded. "1 month," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If it doesn't work, I'll leave. You can give me money for Denver and I'll go." Gideon extended his hand, and they sealed the agreement with a handshake, simple but binding in its own way. There was no turning back now. That evening, they shared a meal, the first one in what felt like forever. The awkwardness between them was palpable, but as they ate, something began to shift. The tension started to fade, replaced by a fragile sense of companionship. When Rose reached out for Gideon, his heart cracked open. She had already begun to heal him in ways he hadn't expected. But the growing bond between them wasn't without its struggles. Over the course of the next week, they tiptoed around one another, figuring out the boundaries, the rhythms of living together. Hea settled into a routine, taking over the kitchen while Gideon focused on the ranch. He had forgotten what it was like to have a real home, and though it was far from perfect, it was something he hadn't realized he needed. But despite the comfort that seemed to build between them, the undercurrent of tension remained. Hea, in her heart, knew she couldn't stay forever. The world outside was waiting for her, and the secrets she carried still weighed heavily on her. But for now, she was here, and for now, they had made a fragile truce. As the evening drew to a close, Gideon caught her eye. "We'll make it work," he said quietly, and though it was an offer, it felt more like a promise. Haya smiled faintly, unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be a new beginning. That night, as they sat across from each other at the table, Haya felt the tension linger in the air, but something else was there too, a spark. Would this arrangement work? Or was it just another illusion in a life full of them? The first few days after their agreement were awkward, as if they were two strangers learning to share the same space. But gradually, routine started to form. Haya, who had spent the last few years in isolation, finding solace only in the care of her daughter, now found herself in a place of movement, an actual home, a place where someone else was there with her. The first week, Gideon and Haya tiptoed around each other, unsure of their roles in the house. Haya took over the kitchen, an area she felt most at ease in. She cooked meals with what little she had, making do with the basic ingredients she could find in the pantry. Gideon, though he didn't have the appetite to eat much, tried to engage with her, offering help that she always politely turned down. Her skill in the kitchen was a reminder of a life she hadn't realized she'd lost, a life filled with love and care, a life that was now shared with another. Gideon, for the first time in years, began to enjoy real meals, savoring every bite. His appetite was slow to return, but the food was a balm for something deeper, something he hadn't known was missing until now. He would sit at the table, watching Haya as she worked, seeing her hands move quickly as she chopped vegetables, stirred pots, and arranged food on the table. There was something about the way she moved with purpose and grace that settled the turmoil in his heart. The sight of the two of them, Haya and Rose, in the warm light of the kitchen, created an odd sense of peace in him, something he hadn't known he craved. Rose, who had been so frail in the beginning, was now thriving. Her cheeks were rounder, her eyes brighter, and her laughter had become a constant sound in the house. Every day, Gideon carved little wooden toys for her, animals and rattles, and sometimes as she reached out for them, a smile would tug at the corner of his lips, a real smile, not the hollow one he had worn for years. The small house, once silent and empty, was beginning to feel like a home. As the second week passed, the awkwardness started to fade. They settled into their roles, understanding one another's rhythms. Gideon would take care of the ranch, checking on the animals, mending fences, and making sure everything was running smoothly. Haya, in turn, took care of the inside of the house, cleaning, cooking, and making sure that Rose was well taken care of. There was a silent understanding between them. Each had something to offer, something the other needed. It was a partnership, unspoken but clear. Evenings were spent by the fire, Haya reading aloud from books she had found in the small library Gideon kept. He listened, his mind focused on the words she spoke, on the way she brought the stories to life. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the quiet moments, the simple things, sitting in the warmth of the fire with Rose on his lap, or listening to Haya's voice as it wove through the pages of a book. On the third week, Haya had decided to take a trip into Stillwater to stock up on supplies. It was a long journey, but she felt it was necessary. The small town, 15 miles away, was the nearest place where she could find what they needed. Gideon offered to go with her, but she insisted on going alone. The wagon ride was bumpy and long, and as Haya approached the town, she noticed the eyes of the people on her. The whispers followed her wherever she went, and the judgment in their eyes was unmistakable. As she passed the general store, the shopkeeper looked up from behind the counter. "Didn't know you had a wife, Thorne," he remarked, his voice laced with something between curiosity and suspicion. Haya flinched at the word wife. She wasn't a wife. Not really. Not in any official sense. She was just a woman who had been taken in by a man who had shown her kindness. The word stung more than she expected. Gideon had called her his employee, a term that, despite its neutrality, made her feel less than what she was. She had agreed to this arrangement, had even thought of it as a temporary thing, but the way others saw her, the way they whispered behind her back, made her feel like an outsider. As she walked back to the wagon, her heart heavy, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. The trip home was tense. Haya kept her thoughts to herself, but Gideon noticed her silence. When they arrived back at the ranch, she went straight to the small room she had made for herself, closing the door behind her. Gideon could feel the weight of her hurt, but he didn't know how to ease it. It wasn't until later that evening, as they sat in silence at the dinner table, that he spoke. "You're not my employee," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "I never wanted you to feel that way. It was a coward's way of saying what I couldn't. You've become more to me than that." Haya looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for truth. She had heard the words, but the doubt still lingered. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. "I haven't had a real life here, Haya. You and Rose, you've brought life back into this house. I didn't want you to leave, not really. But I didn't know how to ask. I'm not good at asking for things." Haya's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, she saw the vulnerability in Gideon. The walls he had built around himself, the barriers he had erected to protect his heart, were slowly crumbling. He wasn't just a man who had taken them in out of pity or obligation. He had opened himself up to them, and in doing so, had allowed something real to form between them. As the fourth week passed, things continued to change. There were still moments of tension, of uncertainty, but the bond between them was undeniable. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch, Haya made a decision. The month was nearly up, and the agreement they had made was coming to an end. She had planned to leave, to send the letter to the charity in Denver, to walk away from this fragile life they had built. But as she looked at Gideon, sitting beside her, holding Rose in his arms, something shifted. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet, not now. There was something here, something more than just survival. It was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected. And maybe, just maybe it was worth staying for. That night, Hayes sat by the fire, writing a letter, her letter to Denver. But as her pen hovered over the page, she stopped. There was one more thing she needed to decide before she could send it. Would she stay, or would she go? The morning Haya decided to tell Gideon that she was leaving, her heart was heavy with a mix of dread and relief. The month was up, and despite the undeniable closeness that had grown between them, she knew she couldn't stay forever. The world outside this ranch was waiting for her, full of possibilities, though none as warm and familiar as what she had found here. She had to move on, for herself, for Rose. The decision had been made, but now she had to confront Gideon. She found him in the paddock with the horses, his back turned as he worked with a stubborn stallion. Her chest tightened as she watched him. He was strong, capable, but there was still something so fragile about him, something he kept hidden behind layers of resilience. As she walked toward him, her footsteps were muffled in the snow, and for a moment, she hesitated. Would he understand? Would he let her go? She had no idea how to say it, but she knew it had to be done. Her throat constricted as she called out to him, but before she could get a word out, the horse, wild and spooked, reared up, its hooves flailing in the air. Haya screamed, instinctively running toward Gideon, but in the chaos, she watched in horror as he was thrown to the ground, trampled by the panicked animal. Her breath caught in her throat as time seemed to freeze. She rushed forward, her hands shaking as she reached for him. The horse was already backing away, its legs skittering across the ice. But Gideon lay motionless, his face pale against the snow, a pool of crimson forming around his head. "Gideon," she cried out, her voice raw with fear. She tried to lift him, but he was too heavy, his body limp and unresponsive. Her heart pounded in her chest as she dragged him, with all her strength, away from the stallion's path. Her mind was a whirlwind of panic and confusion, but she could only focus on one thing: getting him to safety. She managed to pull him into the barn, her hands slipping with the effort. His head wound was severe, and the blood came too freely. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled his head in her lap, pressing cloths against the wound to staunch the bleeding. She couldn't lose him, not like this. Not after everything they had been through. He had saved Rose, and now it was her turn to save him. But the weight of the situation bore down on her. She had to be strong. She had to hold it together for him. As the hours passed, Gideon remained unconscious, his fever rising. Hea tended to him as best she could, her hands working swiftly but with shaking fingers. She had never known this kind of fear, this helplessness. But as she looked at Gideon's pale face, she realized just how much he meant to her. It wasn't just gratitude anymore. It was something deeper, something she couldn't ignore. She was falling in love with him, and that terrified her. But there was no time for fear now. She needed to focus. She moved him to the bed, checking his pulse, his breathing, anything that might tell her he was still alive. She couldn't lose him, not after everything. But in the quiet of the barn, with the soft sound of Gideon's shallow breaths, she realized that losing him was a possibility she hadn't considered, a possibility that shook her to the core. As the day wore on, she refused to leave his side. Rose, oblivious to the danger, played in the corner, her little voice babbling happily. But even that didn't soothe Hea's nerves. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what to do next. Her thoughts circled back to the decision she had made earlier that morning. She had been ready to leave. But now, as she sat beside Gideon, the realization hit her. Leaving didn't feel right. Not anymore. Not when everything was beginning to change. But Gideon, unconscious and vulnerable, was the last person she could confide in. What was she supposed to do now? Would he want her to stay? Would he even survive? When Gideon finally awoke, it was late into the night. Hea had fallen asleep in the chair beside him, her exhaustion taking over, but she woke to the soft sound of his voice. "Hea," he murmured, his words slurred and weak. She shot up, her heart racing. "Gideon, thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling. He blinked up at her, his eyes blurry with fever, but there was a recognition in them that made her breath catch. He was alive, and for a moment, all the doubts, all the fears she had been carrying for the past few days disappeared. He was here. "Don't go," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please." His words hit her like a tidal wave, and her heart cracked wide open. He was asking her to stay. She had been ready to leave, to walk away from this life, but now she couldn't. She couldn't leave him. She held his hand tightly, her tears falling silently onto his skin. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not going anywhere." Gideon's grip on her hand tightened, and for a moment, they were both suspended in the quiet understanding of what had just passed between them. He had been terrified of losing her, just as she had been terrified of losing him. And now, in this moment, with his hand in hers, the world felt a little less heavy. His eyes fluttered closed again, and Hea remained by his side, her heart full of conflicting emotions. She couldn't leave him. Not now. But what did that mean for her future? What did it mean for Rose? Would they have a life here? And if so, what would it look like? These questions buzzed in her mind, but they were questions she didn't have answers to yet. For now, though, she could only focus on getting Gideon back on his feet. She could only focus on the here and now, on the fact that she wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were a blur of worry and care as Hea tended to Gideon's wounds, nursing him back to health. She fed him soup, changed his bandages, and kept a constant vigil by his side. Slowly, his strength returned, and with it, the quiet but undeniable shift between them. The distance that had once existed between them, between the man who had lost so much and the woman who had nothing left to lose, was slowly starting to close. As Gideon regained his strength, He watched Hea with new eyes, seeing her not just as someone who needed help, but as someone who had given him something he never thought he'd have again: hope. And in the quiet moments when he looked at her, he realized he didn't want her to go. He didn't want to lose her. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a brilliant orange, Gideon found Hea sitting on the porch, rocking Rose in her arms. The sight of her, of the two of them, brought a lump to his throat. He walked over to her, his steps slow but purposeful, and sat down beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, easy, but then Gideon broke it, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You were going to leave," he said softly. Hea looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't deny it, but in the quiet of that moment, it didn't matter anymore. "I was," she admitted, "but I'm not going anywhere now." The words hung between them, and in that instant, Hea realized that everything had changed. Her heart, once full of fear and doubt, was now full of something else, something that felt like home. As Gideon sat beside her, the weight of their shared silence heavy in the air, he knew that they had crossed a threshold. Their lives were no longer just a series of fleeting moments. They were building something real. But where would it take them? Would this fragile bond they had created withstand the challenges of the future? Only time would tell, but for now, they had each other. And that was enough. The days that followed were a mixture of calm and quiet understanding. Gideon's recovery was slow, but each passing day brought him back to himself. And as his strength returned, so did the warmth that had been absent from the ranch for so long. Hea found herself more at ease with him, the awkwardness of their initial arrangement fading into something deeper, more meaningful. She had stayed, just as she promised, but as the weeks passed, she found herself questioning everything. What had started as a temporary arrangement, a mutual understanding born out of necessity, had slowly shifted into something neither of them had expected. There were moments when she caught herself thinking of them as a family: Gideon, herself, and Rose, just the three of them, working together, living together, finding solace in the mundane tasks of everyday life. But there were also moments of doubt, moments when the weight of her past, of everything she had lost, threatened to overwhelm her. She knew she couldn't keep pretending. She had to face the truth that had been stirring within her for weeks. She loved him. It wasn't just gratitude for everything he had done for her and Rose. It was something deeper, something that had grown quietly, over time, like the tender roots of a flower, slowly pushing through the soil. She loved him, and it terrified her. Love had never been something she believed in after losing her husband. She had been so determined to keep her heart closed, to protect herself and Rose from further pain, that she had never allowed herself to truly feel anything for another person. But Gideon had broken down her walls, piece by piece, without even realizing it. His kindness, his vulnerability, the way he cared for her and Rose, it had all led her to this moment, this realization that she couldn't run from her heart any longer. And yet, the thought of confessing it to him, of letting him know how she felt, was terrifying. She didn't know if he felt the same. She didn't know if he saw her the way she saw him. For days, she wrestled with her emotions. But it was in the quiet of a late afternoon, with the sun casting golden light over the ranch, that she finally made the decision. She had to tell him. There was no turning back now. Hea had been working in the garden, planting flowers for the first time in years. The soil felt good between her fingers. The act of nurturing something new, something beautiful, offering a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. It was in the midst of planting a small row of daisies that Gideon appeared beside her, looking more like his old self with each passing day. His eyes were clear, his body no longer weighed down by fever, and the lines of grief that had once marred his face seemed less pronounced. He was still the same man, the same rugged rancher who had taken them in, but there was something in the way he looked at her now, something in the way he watched her as she worked. It was almost as if he too, was seeing her in a different light. He crouched down beside her, offering his help, but Hea was too lost in her thoughts to notice. When she looked up, their eyes met, and for a moment, everything else faded away. The air between them crackled with unspoken words, with the weight of what had been left unsaid. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice softer than usual. Hea took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "about everything. About us." Gideon didn't say anything right away, but the way he looked at her told her he understood. He had been waiting for this moment, too. He had been waiting for her to make the first move, just as he had been waiting for the right moment to confess the truth he had been carrying inside him for weeks. I think I've been lying to myself," Hea continued, her voice gaining strength. "I've been pretending that this arrangement, this life here, was just temporary, that I was going to leave, that it wasn't real." She paused, searching his face for any sign of judgment, any indication that he might not feel the same way. But there was nothing but understanding in his eyes. "But the truth is," she whispered, "I don't want to leave. I don't want to go anywhere. Not when I'm finally starting to feel something real. I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." The silence that followed felt like an eternity, a moment suspended in time. Hea's heart hammered in her chest, and for a brief moment, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, if her confession would drive him away. But then Gideon reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and steady, grounding her in the moment. He didn't say anything for a long time, but the look in his eyes was enough. "Hea," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been afraid. Afraid to let anyone close again. Afraid that if I let myself feel, I'd lose it all over again. But then you came here, and you and Rose, you started to make this house feel like home again. You made me feel like I could breathe again." His thumb brushed over the back of her hand, the gesture tender but filled with something stronger, something deeper. "I didn't know how to say it, but I love you too. I've loved you for longer than I care to admit." Hea's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to feel the same way. But here he was, confessing his love for her, just as she had confessed hers. And in that moment, everything changed. The weight of the past, the grief, the fear, all of it seemed to melt away. There was no more pretending, no more running. They had both been afraid, but now they were finally ready to face the future together. Gideon stood, pulling her to her feet, his hands holding hers with a quiet intensity. He looked down at her, his gaze steady and filled with conviction. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Not just for now, but forever. I want you and Rose here. I want to build a life with you. A real life. Together." Hea's heart swelled with a mixture of joy and relief. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment that would change everything. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will stay. Forever." Gideon smiled, a rare, full smile that reached his eyes and softened the lines of his face. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in years, Hea felt truly home. The world outside may have been full of uncertainty, but here, in this moment, there was nothing but love. Nothing but the promise of a future together. As the days passed, their love grew stronger, more certain. The ranch became not just a place to survive, but a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the steady rhythm of everyday life. 6 weeks later, in the spring, they were married. It was a simple ceremony, the preacher traveling from a nearby town, the neighbors gathering to witness their vows. Hea wore a blue dress, the color of new beginnings, while Rose stood beside them as the flower girl. The vows they exchanged were heartfelt, promises of love and loyalty, of standing together through everything life had to offer. "I vow to never let you doubt your worth," Gideon said, his voice strong but filled with emotion. I vow to stand beside you through grief and joy, through everything that comes our way." Hea's voice trembled as she spoke her vows. "I vow to love you, to cherish you, to build a life with you, and to never leave you, no matter what." The kiss they shared was slow, tender, and filled with the promise of forever. As the guests cheered, Gideon and Hea walked away together, hand in hand, ready to face the future as a family. 6 months later, the ranch was alive with the sounds of spring. Rose, now 14 months old, took her first steps, calling out Papa as she tottered across the yard. Hea, visibly pregnant with their second child, stood beside Gideon, watching their daughter grow before their eyes. The garden they had planted was flourishing, the flowers bright and colorful, a reflection of the life they had built together. As the sun set behind the mountains, Gideon sat on the porch with Hea, reading aloud from a book she had taught him to read. Their family, once broken and fragile, was now whole. And as Gideon looked at Hea, his heart full, he whispered, "Who knew the worst night of my life would lead to this?" Hea smiled, her hand resting on her growing belly, her heart full of love. "Sometimes we have to break before we can heal," she replied softly. "Thank you for opening your door. Thank you for staying," Gideon said, his voice thick with emotion. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, they knew they had found something that would last. A love that would endure, no matter what came their way. Their family, together on the porch, a peaceful home, life restored under the Montana sunset.